So welcome everyone. Melissa, why don't we go ahead and start the screen. Just wanted to welcome everyone to our session. So glad to see you all this morning.
Before I do that, I'm going to put a link to our resources in the chat. This is a Google Doc that has a bibliography that we use for this presentation, and then I will share our screen.
Great. Nope, that is showing your Google Drive.
Okay.
Great.
Oh, do you saw it? You saw it?
Yeah, no, that was right.
Okay. I'm so sorry. All right, here we go.
It's okay.
That's right. All right, great.
So we wanted to welcome everyone today, and what we're going to be talking about, we're hoping to start a conversation. So we're hoping to kind of set the stage and then have a conversation with you all. But we're going to be talking about kind of the impacts of COVID and this idea that it's not just our current students who are going to be experiencing some challenges as a result of COVID, but that we are looking at the possibility that we now are going to be dealing with the disrupted educational and social development of students for the next decade. And so we wanted to go through some of the findings from the literature that is out there so far, recognizing that this is, of course, an emergent area. As Melissa said, she has put the bibliography of the various things that we have read into the chat. There's the Google Doc there. And then we're going to be kind of just opening the floor for some discussion after we share some of the findings. But first of all, I want to introduce myself and have Melissa introduce herself. For those who don't know me, my name is Gwendolyn Reese. I'm the Director of Research, Teaching, and Learning at American University. And I have been on many a WRLC committee for a long time. So I'm so happy to see you all this morning. Melissa?
I'm Melissa Becker. I'm the Associate Director of Research, Teaching, and Learning at American University. Happy to be here today.
Great. So if you want to go on to the first slide.
Okay.
Wonderful, thank you. So the first thing that we're going to talk a little bit about, drawing on the literature, is some of the impacts of the pandemic from the education literature that Melissa has given you the link to. And I'm going to start talking about the K through 12 findings thus far, because as I just said, part of the challenge that we need to be thinking about is that it is not just our students currently that have had disrupted experiences. They are also occurring in the lower grades, and it is therefore likely that there is some possibility that this is going to transfer into our students for the future, for the foreseeable future. So some of the things that we wanted to talk about that's in the literature, first of all, there's the academic impact. And there seems to be some question about whether or not the impacts academically on the fact that students through the, all the way from preschool up through, the high school students, that they were online for quite some time. And it's unknown, frankly, at this point, whether or not these impacts are going to be short-term or long-term impacts. But we saw a number of things, including there was a very significant drop in kindergarten enrollment. And accompanying that, since we have a few years of data, that the drop in kindergarten enrollment was then correlated with the fact that there's a larger number of students that when they did enter school in the compulsory education years, that they were not demonstrating reading readiness. So by the time they were beginning their school and career, they were already behind. In California partially because of course it's a very large state, it also has a central board of education and they have various tests. That's one of the studies that has some of the largest pools, study pools and samples for information. And so some of what they were finding coming out of their tests is that overall, in the various grades in which they test, there was a 2.6 months lag of, looking at the entire student body in the English language arts, and a 2.5 month lag in math, which are the two areas that they study. But importantly, this was across everyone. Importantly, there are also differential outcomes that, many of the students who are already in underserved communities were experiencing an even greater lag. So for the English language learner population, that was the most extreme, where it was a 3.8 month lag in English language arts and a 3.1 months lag in math. Students with disabilities were experiencing a 3.0 a month lag in English language arts and 2.8 in math. And then the one that was particularly significant for the Latinx population was the 3.4 month lag in ELA. The math was not significantly different than the overall population. And that was out of the various demographic groups, the ones that had the most significance. But one of the things to note from earlier studies of when they were translating, what does it mean to have a lag into long-term learning loss, is that because learning is cumulative, the estimate is that if you lose a year in grade 3, that becomes the equivalent of losing 2.8 years of education by the time they graduate from high school. So this is for us to be thinking about, what kinds of long-term possibilities we may be facing as students gradually come from high school into universities. Melissa. As I mentioned, another part that is particularly concerning about this is that it is very unequal. And in particular, the underserved students are also the ones hit the hardest by impacts. And there's a lot of reasons for this. The underserved students tended not to have as reliable internet. They tended not to have a dedicated quiet space that was theirs in order to attend school online, even if they did have reliable internet. And in addition to that, which, I'm kind of jumping here, but they were far more likely to be in an online only environment if they were in a more in a school that had a higher population of disadvantaged students, and in particular economically disadvantaged students. So one of the things that's important for us to try to understand is that there is a difference between learning loss and learning lag. And the California report that I mentioned earlier, they were calling them, learning lags. But what the point is that if you don't have good intervention in a learning lag, that it becomes a learning loss. So with learning lags, if you have very focused intervention, that can be made up. So the focused intervention that seems to work is to focus on foundational skills, because again, learning is cumulative, to have very direct intervention. And part of what they were finding as absolutely necessary was that you need to assess where students actually are and then design from there. So there does have to be that very important assessment piece, and then the flexibility to be able to match the instruction and the interventions that are being given into where students actually are. But part of the challenge here is that there were a lot of attendance problems, even when schools went back. In addition to the attendance problems, because in the online environment, you couldn't necessarily tell if they were really there, they couldn't necessarily get there. But even when you went back, we've seen like this increase in attendance problems. In addition to that, and we know there's research out there talking about the long-term impacts of malnourishment on cognitive development and on educational development. Many of the low-income students, the only time they might eat during a day is when they are getting their free and reduced meal at school. And so while some school districts were better able to figure out ways to provide that than others, this is still, it means that we have a greater number of students at young ages in which they are experiencing malnourishment, and that can interrupt some of the cognitive development. as I mentioned, there's significant economic differentials. And in particular, in California, those schools that were able to go back to face-to-face instruction, which on all of these impacts works better, there's just no question that it was working better, was 3 times higher for schools that had the least number of economically disadvantaged students and students of color. So again, that like writes into this entire next generation a significant inequity in terms of the kinds of privilege that students are seeing here. In addition to that, because as universities, we have a good number of international students as well, it's important to recognize that this situation is not just US, but the international situation as well. Many poorer countries, students were completely out of the schooling. They were into, the labor force rather than receiving homeschooling, and all of the same kinds of, for those who were not, who maintained their schooling, it's the same kind of situation internationally in terms of the inequities and in terms of the impacts of moving online. There's also, of course, the social and emotional impact. And I did want to mention here as well, I've been reading a fabulous book that is not in our reading list, but I'm going to recommend it anyway. It's called Stolen Focus, and it's looking at the impact of our various social media and other kinds of surveillance capitalism and so forth on our ability to pay attention and how that impacts at different age ranges. And of course, in this situation, what we've been in, when people were isolated and they were completely online, that meant that they were being driven in more ways towards our social media landscape as well in order to be connected at all. But it's not a healthy environment for cognitive development and for attention. And just generally, we know that it has a lot of times pretty negative emotional impacts. So these are some of the things that were were addressed in the literature that will be impacting the students who will be coming to us over the next decade or so.
So we've heard from Gwendolyn about the impacts on K-12 with COVID-19. We're also starting to see some reports come out about how the college student experience has been over the last year. And there are some noticeable impacts that have happened as students have come back to school after the pandemic. There's an interesting article in our little article in our resource list from University Wire, in which professors who taught both at Westmont College in California, which was an in-person situation, and the University of California at Santa Barbara, that was an online situation, noticed some particular things about their students this year, primarily a lag in personal development, particularly in students' ability to their discussion skills, basically, and their desire to their comfort level with talking in groups of people. The students at Santa Barbara, when the online remote situation, lagged behind those who had an in-person experience in this particular type of skill. And they found that the students that had experienced the remote learning were much more uncomfortable with talking in groups of people. Also, what we're finding in this literature from professors, both this article and Chronicle of Education article, and then a New York Times opinion piece, is a high level of disengagement from students in many kinds of situations and many kinds of institutions, both with attendance. Some professors reporting as many as a third of their students regularly not showing up for class. And also in terms of assignments, some professors report not being able to motivate students to complete assignments or to participate in class. This could be a coping mechanism for stress and anxiety and exhaustion, which has also been reported both by faculty members and students in this year coming back. There was data from the Collegiate Mental Health Institute that showed that as students were coming back to school in fall 2021, the level of social anxiety rose significantly, whereas the anxiety about schoolwork actually dropped, but social anxiety was still very high. And skipping class and not engaging with assignments could be a result, could be a coping mechanism for this kind of stress. Also, professors are noticing that students are struggling more with tests. And some professors are reporting the worst performance on tests in 2021 that they've ever seen in their careers, with students struggling to recall even basic information. The University Wire article, the professors were quoted that students don't seem to know what they should know by this point. They were talking about students that had taken remote classes for their freshman and sophomore classes, and then came back in person for their upper level classes. But they reported that the students just didn't seem to know what they really should have known, what they should have learned in those lower level classes. And this, of course, there are more failures now and more withdrawals from school. And also some concerns showing up, particularly in the New York Times piece about the response from faculty, which has been to lower the rigor of their classes, basically. There have been some studies done that are saying that 1/2 of the faculty that were interviewed for the study in 2021 had lowered expectations for quantity from their students. 1/3 of faculty that were interviewed had lower expectations of quality for their students. And the problem with this is that this is perhaps leading to students not learning the skills that they're going to really need to succeed in in-person classes. It is thought that maybe, the lowered expectations over the year of being in Zoom has encouraged the wrong kinds of study habits. And then students come to school and they find that they're not prepared, and it's hard to then get those skills back. And concerning, also is my last comment, that professors are finding that students are either not or very slow to bounce back from remote learning. And so this could continue on for the next, however long, the next few years. In addition, just in our regular informal communication with teaching faculty here at American University, we have found support for some of the literature, and also, maybe some additional things, because in American University this spring we had a month of online. We had January classes were all online. Students didn't come back to in-person classes until February. And what that kind of led to, according to faculty reports that we've talked to, is that students didn't really bond very well this semester. They didn't have cohesion. One faculty member told me that usually by about spring break, the students really, they know each other, they feel safe talking to each other, they really get going. There's really lots of progress in learning made after spring break. Well, this semester, they didn't reach that point until 2 weeks before the semester ended, which, created quite a different learning experience for the students than had been in the past. Many students have been out sick with COVID. And so there has been sort of a loss of class cohesion just from people being out and being isolated. The lack of connection to the meaningfulness of what we are doing, that was also reported in some of the articles, that there seemed to be a sense of purpose, why we're actually at university. Also, I'm sure we're all feeling this, the impact at American University of the remote learning was significant on our budget. And many schools are experiencing hiring freezes, leading to staffing shortages, and scrambling, for finances. And this has had an impact too on our ability to fulfill our mission to our students. There are students, coming from high school that maybe have not spent a lot of time in their school library. And so, for us as librarians, is left us kind of wondering, will they not having that experience in their high school library, what does that mean for us at the college level? And finally, the thing that is also concerning is that we may be in a time now where these kinds of disruptions are more frequent. There could be other pandemics, there's the political climate, and also as we have more effects of climate change, perhaps more disasters that affect and disrupt education, both at the K through 12 and at the higher ed level.
Yeah, and actually, I just want to build on that thing that Melissa just said. I'm going to jump in real fast and say, American University Library is in the midst of some strategic planning at the moment. And one of the things that we had identified as a threat is that we actually think that future disruptions are not just possible, we think they're probable, and that needs to be built into our thinking. So I just wanted to highlight that piece. So a few different considerations as we're trying to think through, and we're not going to we're bringing you a conversation, we're not bringing you conclusions, because this is something I think we're all trying to figure our way out through, is that we can't assume that students are where they need to be. We just can't make that assumption at this point. So part of what this means, going back into that, like what works for appropriate intervention, is that we need to assess or identify where students actually are, and then try to design for that. And that is, I think, a challenge for us as libraries, because we often don't have direct access to their academic work. So this is something that I think we're going to need to work with our faculty, our teaching faculty partners, to try to get some sense about. Because lags, if they can be addressed, and you can have interventions early enough, they can be addressed. But part of the challenge that was also found in some of the literature that is in the document that Melissa has shared is that there are problems with bridging experiences. So like one of the ways in which universities have often tried to address learning lags is to say, oh, well, we're going to create, a special program that's going to happen over the summer or something along those lines. And part of the problem there is that when it is set up as kind of remediation, that this becomes another thing that makes the students feel badly about themselves, and is demoralizing to them. And that there is kind of a challenge there, because part of what we're also dealing with is an increased lack of confidence in their ability to do the work. And so we can end up inadvertently reinforcing something that gets in the way of growth mindset, from Carol Dweck, where it's, the growth mindset is where you take how you're doing and you have confidence that you can improve, versus a fixed trait mindset of I just can't, as though it's an essential trait. And so one of the things that is being observed is that, students, as we said, they were already, those of us who've been around a while, students have become more and more kind of brittle in a certain way over time. And then we have this jump right now in this situation. So we need to be thinking about some way to provide scaffolding without demoralizing them. Another thing here is trying to think through how is it that we can help students with kind of these personal development issues, because students really did not make the transition from high school to college students well. And many of them have adopted habits that don't help them succeed. So is there something that we as libraries can do, especially given that we are in kind of an unusual position of often being in kind of a coaching situation without grading them? And so is there something that we can do to assist with that?
Okay, so now we're turning the program over to phase 2, which is the discussion. We'd like to have some discussion about some of these questions and things. And Gwendolyn, should I stop sharing the screen at this point so we can see people?
Yeah, why don't you stop sharing the screen and we can
access.
like read the first question and then we can have a discussion. That way we can see
Yeah.
people. Yeah.
Hold on. Good. So our first question for you today is, what observations do you have about the impacts of the pandemic at your institution from interacting with either college students or K-12 students that you may have at home and faculty? What have you seen?
Shira.
Hi, I'm Shira Eller. I'm from George Washington University. What you described is basically just describing exactly what we've seen and observed, I think. We work really closely with first-year students in our university writing program. And the faculty have really expressed a lot of concern about attendance, completion of assignments, and then not really knowing where to go with that because the students are very anxious. So they want to accommodate them, but then they don't want them to fall behind, and then there's too much to catch up on. So just basically exactly what you said is what we've been seeing.
Thank you. I'm going to read here from Kathy at UDC, where she says that that is also their experience, compounded by the fact that many of our students are juggling jobs and caregiving responsibilities, and that the faculty are struggling as well. I see there was also a bunch of very interesting things. I'm just going to go back and read that were from Pete, where he was saying that many of the described sociocultural impacts for college students parallel the experience of new college students who grew up abroad. And that makes this seem like mass culture, shock, trauma, plus there's the academic lag loss. So really kind of a transition shock. So I have a question for all of you on a library position. One of the things that happened at AU that I'm trying to understand what it means is that our direct research, our walk up, kind of direct research chat and so forth for reference, like the reference chat, the numbers just fell off a cliff this year. And I don't know whether or not that is going to be predictive of the future, or if that is something that is just like this year is actually worse than in the pandemic when we were only online. And I don't know whether or not that is like the disengagement that, we were hearing about, where they can't manage and therefore weren't asking for help, or if it's that faculty members have tried to ensure that they're not overwhelming students because they're so afraid of how brittle they are that they just didn't give rigorous research assignments to the same level. I really don't know what to make of it, but are the rest of you finding something similar? Anybody? Are your stats the same or are they dropping? Joan. Joan, if you're trying to speak, you're on mute.
Yeah, our numbers dropped off significantly as well. But the reason it's really unclear, students, for example, may not may have gotten used to not coming into the library because of the COVID restrictions. Another possibility is our enrollment has decreased significantly over the past 2 years. And then the third reason is I think given the shortage of staff, we've had a lot of staff leave, that is both faculty and staff. But with faculty shortages, I'm wondering if the assignments are just pretty basic at this point. Because there's, I think the classes can't always rely on attendance because students will test positive and then they're out for a while. And it may be that they're just making the assignments simpler.
Yeah, and at least for us, our term faculty and our adjuncts, their student evaluations of teaching are pretty much the thing that keeps them their job, right? And so there's a pretty strong incentive structure, I kind of feel, to make sure that your students don't fail out. And I do wonder about is there a decline in rigor, such as was suggested?
That's true. That's possible as well.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else want to weigh in, or should we move on to our next question? Reading from Kathy, our virtual stats are pretty consistent with what they were during fully remote, but we also see the impact of the return in some in-person services. One thing I think we really missed, especially for students who are not yet familiar with academic libraries, is the serendipity of students walking in to do things like print and then realizing the scope of research support and other resources we offer. Thank you. Shall we open the next question, Melissa?
Yes, our next question is your library doing anything to address any short-term impacts of the pandemic, such as student disengagement and lags in personal development? I think we could broaden that to, is your library doing anything, or are you thinking of doing anything?
Yeah.
Or are there plans that would be interesting for us to know about?
Pete, are you willing to say anything about that? Pete says that he's working really hard not to run away when also stressed.
Kind of tongue in cheek there. It's the disengagement and the stress is also there for us. So I just wanted to kind of say that, being mindful of that, as well as mindful of the student's emotional state during reference interactions and instruction. There's a lot of reassurance in that way, almost the emotional bartender approach. So, you're doing this research and it's stressful. It's always been a component in instruction and reference, but it's really, really important now.
I see here, well, why don't we have Joan go, and then there's a question from Kathy in the chat.
No, we're not doing anything specifically, although it's a good question and something we should think about. One of the things that we're running into generally is, again, because we've had a loss of faculty and we are having more adjuncts, connecting with them so we can know more about their students is also becoming more difficult, because there's fewer of them, they have more assignments, and so we're trying a little bit more just one-on-one. We used to try to have our librarians go to department meetings. We have had mixed success about that. Now we're trying a more one-on-one approach.
Great, thank you. I see here that Kathy is asking a question that maybe we can weigh in on, which is anyone else feeling the sense of needing to hold it together a bit more because everyone around us is struggling so much? I'm going to say I resonate with that. Anyone else want to weigh in? Jade?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm lower my hand. Okay, I'm Jade Madrid. I'm at Georgetown, and I'm a liaison librarian for Latin American Studies. And just today, I was thinking about how I'm feeling a little disconnected from some of my departments, and it's really, I mean, I feel like we're so far into this, but it really has to do with this in-person and virtual context. So, you know, I used to do office hours. So I used to go sit in the departments and see people. And I just, obviously I stopped doing that with the pandemic and just haven't felt, I don't know, the urge or comfortable to start it back up again. And the same, like there was, you know, a big graduation reception in an embassy. And it was, I mean, it's something that I would normally go to and see everyone and enjoy. So very like social. But I looked at the RSVP and it said, I remember it was 150 or 200 people were invited, and I just didn't feel comfortable going. So I just think, I don't know, just to wrap it up with your first question, I was thinking like about, you know, how students are dealing with this transition, and how in one of my graduate programs, a faculty member was saying that the student had to go home to like do some sort of, there's some caregiving or something, and they kind of switched to virtual. And then they said, you know, it's just so much more tiring to go in person, which is normally, I mean, we hear more about how students really want to be in person, but it just highlighted for me that basically students are feeling all kinds of these transitions all the time. So feeling it being in person, feeling it being virtual, feeling it when there's a change. And then I think even though so much time has passed, I feel also like ambivalence towards a lot of things that used to be just part of my job and rewarding, but things that stopped, and I'm just not really sure if or when to start them up again. So just to kind of echo what everybody says, it's they're going through it, and I think we're going through it too.
Yeah, I'm going to mention one other thing that kind of what you just said resonated that I didn't mention. I mean, there's a lot in those articles, and obviously we couldn't bring all of it to you because then we would have no chance for discussion. But one of the things that they were saying is that there's an increased kind of emphasis that happened during the pandemic for adult education. So, you know, they're talking more about adult education to move that online, and they're suspecting that's going to stay that way. And when I was reading that, even though what they're talking about is, you know, other forms of adult education rather than necessarily university, I was thinking, you know, I bet you from what I'm seeing, a lot of graduate programs that are more applied, that for us, you know, we have a lot of graduate programs that people take while they are fully employed. And for a lot of them, I do suspect, even though we know on an educational basis, it doesn't necessarily work as well. Just what you were saying, Jade, about like the stress of trying to do the caregiving and, you know, everything else and working. I do wonder whether or not some of those are going to continue to move online and stay that way for the graduate. Lizzie says, certainly something to think about and possibly work on over the summer if we can find the time. I lost the thread about what comment that was in relation to. I'm sorry.
I think that was in relation to the question, the discussion question.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Is there any more discussion or comments on this question of what we're doing or maybe thinking about doing to address impacts of the pandemic? If not, let's move on to our third question for our last 6 minutes of this session. The third question is, will the long-term effects of the COVID slide affect us? And those would be some of the things that Gwendolyn was talking about with the K-12 situation. Do we think that you know, a decade from now, we'll still be experiencing these effects with the students that we're serving? And if so, can we do anything now or start trying to do anything now to help mitigate these effects?
I'm going to say that one of the things I am very concerned about that I'll just mention is that, you know, as we've talked about, there's also the massive economic impacts from all of this and other things. And I suspect it is an overwhelming question. But I suspect that fewer and fewer students, and it was already moving in this direction, are going to have prior experience with libraries, with both public libraries or school libraries. And so they're not necessarily going to know what we do and what we could do for them. And so I have long-term concerns about trying to do marketing at the level of this is even what a library is and this is what we can do for you. I haven't figured out how to handle that, but I'm just going to say that's on my mind. Shira.
Yeah, and I would just say that some of the assumptions, and this is, you touched on this in the presentation. For example, when I would have some upper level or like honors students, I would kind of have this idea like that I would skip the more basic things and go into the advanced research techniques or whatever. And in one of the sessions, it sort of came out that the students didn't know how to find books on the shelf. And then I sort of was like, oh my God, what am I doing? You know, and I sort of was like, let's stop and rewind all of this and kind of be like, do you need, you know, do you understand this? Do you know how to do this? Like before going on to these more advanced things. So I think there's going to be kind of a lot of that going on.
Joan asked, does the question presume that higher ed stayed basically the same? I think colleges and universities are changing out of necessity. Agreed. And I guess part of the question is, you know, we're just trying to get ourselves thinking about what part of the changes do we want to try to drive in a particular way is always what I'm interested personally in, like just to have us thinking about that. I mean, I'll say for myself again, because I'm just going to say it. One of the things that I really wonder about that I think that I'm seeing, and I don't know if this is going to be a long-term thing, I do think that our students are more anxious. You know, we saw this with their like wanting to talk in class, that they're more anxious in classes and that they seem to be craving more one-on-one attention. And so I keep wondering about like, you know, they're not necessarily using our walk-up services, but we are still seeing very high appointments. And I wonder if things are going to move more in that direction, which is maybe powerful, but it's also really difficult to scale, especially as we have talked about, you know, with our own staffing cutbacks and burnout. So I'm trying to kind of think through some of that. So the virtual appointments are also very popular. Okay. Are you guys finding that as well? Yes, at UDC with Kathy. Pete is wondering whether or not anyone else has a very high percentage of no-shows in virtual appointments. I know we have some, but I have not heard that they are worse than what we would experience with in-person appointment no-shows. Summit CU. Shira says they're using Calendly, and so they have on the remind feature. Is there anything else that you all want to talk about in our last remaining few minutes? I guess minute. So I just want to thank you all for being here. I know that this is a big, overwhelming topic, but like I said, we wanted to share with you because we also know that none of us have all the time, at least the bibliography and some of the kind of condensed, findings. But I think this is going to be something that we're going to have to be thinking about and maybe should be a topic for future conversations. But I also want to thank everyone who contributed.
Right. The articles in our resource list, we found really, really interesting, and probably just the beginning of studies coming out about COVID impacts. So please feel free to look at those. And I also want to thank everyone for coming today.
So should we stop recording?
Yes, I'm going to stop that right now.
Thank you, Derek.
Sure thing.